Hi everyone, my name is Jieun Sung. I'm a second year PhD student in the program in the Social Foundations of Education at Curry. I want to begin by thanking the PVI Collective for your support and also this year's cohort of graduate fellows. It's been a pleasure to hear about your scholarship, and it's an honor to be presenting alongside you today. I'll be speaking to you about my research, which examines the language acquisition experiences of adult refugees and the implications of dominant language literacy for constructing and reinforcing identity and legitimacy. I'll begin by sharing a short anecdote. My family came to the U.S. as immigrants when I was 4 years old. At the time, my father was pursuing his own doctorate in mechanical engineering at NC State. This was during the days of Jimmy Valvano, for any basketball fans. As you might imagine, my dad is fairly competent at math and science as a mechanical engineer. But during the first few semesters he taught undergraduate calculus, many of his students ignored or complained about or even mocked him, citing the inability to understand him. A few years later, as my family prepared to move north to DC, my parents sat me down in front of the nightly news and instructed me to emulate the way Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw spoke. Even at that age, I intuitively understood that how I would be perceived, that is, my legibility and legitimacy, was tied to my ability to use the English language grammatically and correctly with the right accent. Though, of course, at the time, I didn't have the words to express this in this way. I share this anecdote because experiences like these, that is, my early encounters with the symbolic and sometimes real power exerted by language, have helped shape my conceptual understanding and framework for this study. But before we get to that, we'll turn briefly to some background context. As you may already be familiar, there are approximately 22.5 million refugees worldwide, including 17.2 million under UNHCR mandate and 5.3 million Palestinian refugees registered by UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. Permanent resettlement is achieved only by a small proportion of the overall refugee population, only about 1%. And indeed, resettlement is only one part of an extended, circuitous trajectory of displacement during which individuals may have significant experiences of violence and instability, having fled persecution and conflict. These refugee situations have become increasingly extended and may last between 5 and 70 years, which I realize is a very large range, with an average of approximately 25 years. As you might imagine, this experience can have profound implications for the lives of individuals and families. In 2016, over 189,000 refugees were resettled, including nearly 85,000 to the U.S. Now, this number, of course, has dropped significantly, and under the present administration, the U.S. limit on refugee admissions has been capped at historically low levels. And just for a little bit of context, it's estimated that approximately 3% of the greater Charlottesville area's residents are refugees. I turn now to my conceptual framework, which maintains focus on value orientation and a concern with power. This is particularly salient given typical reductive narratives of refugees as helpless victims in need of humanitarian aid and rescue. That is, the condition and status of being a refugee is embedded within a broader discourse with dimensions of violence and power, both political and otherwise. I also engage with Derrida's deconstructive work, acknowledging that culture institutes itself through an imposition of some politics of language, such that as refugees encounter the dominant language of their new host society, they may simultaneously experience de facto interdicts, or prohibitions, on access to the language of their countries and cultures of origin, and that these prohibitions or interdicts may be exercised in subtle, peaceful, silent, and liberal ways. Furthermore, this framework maintains an understanding that linguistic exchanges convey relations of symbolic power. To paraphrase, the state and state formation itself are conducive to conditions that allow for a unified linguistic market, dominated by some official language, which becomes the theoretical norm or benchmark. That is, refugees' mastery of the official language of their host society has real and consequential impacts on their ability to access the institutions and resources of the state, which bound and define their own relationship with and status within the state. And indeed, interaction with the dominant language of the host society is inextricably tied to notions of legitimacy, authority, and identity, as well as more pragmatic and instrumental concerns relating to educational and economic opportunities. Moreover, schools and education more broadly serve as primary acculturating institutions in which key interactions occur. And so this study engages with an interpretive paradigm that turns the focus toward the emic perspectives of refugee learners as they experience, interact with, and negotiate a course in English for speakers of other languages, ESOL, in the US. So these are my research questions, and they really focus on notions of culture and social expectations as they are constructed and circulate within the class, how the aims and goals of the students align with others' conceptualizations of the learning purpose of this course, and how classroom actors view their respective and relational roles as student and teacher, and relatedly, how authority operates and flows through classroom interactions. So this research was conducted over a period of approximately 4 months in an advanced level adult ESOL class. The students range in age from their early 20s through their mid-50s, so again, a pretty broad range. And about 2/3 of the students were female in this particular class. And attendance varied between 15 and 20 students each time the class met. Because the students are adults, their ability to attend was often constrained by external responsibilities and commitments, such as work and family. The refugee students in the class was comprised of students from a broad range of countries. The refugee students in particular were from Syria, Afghanistan, Burma, Iraq, and Bhutan. So I was a participant, observer, and volunteer in this space, conducting over 36 hours of observation, as well as semi-structured interviews with classroom participants and informal interviews with other stakeholders. And I augmented this research by collecting and analyzing documents such as worksheets and other instructional materials. And throughout data collection, I used Erickson's analytic induction to analyze the data continuously and iteratively. So that is, I recursively and iteratively combed through the entire body of data to generate empirical assertions, and then I systematically tested those assertions against the data corpus again to find confirming and disconfirming evidence. So these are the 3 assertions that emerged from the data, which I will go into in more detail. So the first is that notions of culture and social norms are embedded in both are embedded explicitly and implicitly in curricular content. And I realize that this is a lot, so I'm happy to share the slides later. So lessons about American culture were incorporated explicitly into the lesson plans, and they often centered on, quote, traditional American holidays such as Thanksgiving or, in this case, Halloween. The teacher appeared to associate the students' participation in these prototypically American activities with acculturating into American society. The students, on the other hand, were more ambivalent, and even the students who indicated more active participation in these activities were often those who had young children, particularly young children in schools, or who also described a connection between American culture and its enactment vis-a-vis traditional celebrations and activities. Efforts to convey American social norms and practices often took the form of more implicit activities situated within or around the explicit instructional content. Here, the teacher repeats her question about a student's weekend when he responds in a way that she is not expecting. When Kevin continues to reply in a more truthful and genuine way, for instance, talking about his health issues, the teacher seems thrown off balance. The teacher used this informal exercise on a weekly basis to familiarize students with the American social practice of saying, "Hey, how are you?" and responding along the lines of, "Fine, thanks, and you?" So such lessons, both implicit and explicit, were anchored in particular hegemonic constructions of what constitutes American culture and appropriate social behavior, as well as how students ought to engage and interact with these constructions. The second assertion to emerge from the data was that language learning goals were integrated with larger projects having to do with practical instrumental concerns and aims. So here students are referencing the explicit direct aims of the course to master the ability to speak English grammatically. And these are all pseudonyms. They picked the names, actually. So Nina here connects this mastery of English to the notion of being, or at least appearing to be, an educated individual. That is, she connects her ability to speak grammatical, correct English to her own legibility to others in her new community as an educated person. Of course, for students, this language mastery also has very real implications for their future trajectories and opportunities. This was especially the case for students who had relatively high educational and career experiences in their countries of origin. Access to educational and economic resources and the social and economic status that could accrue as a result was contingent upon successful acquisition of the dominant language of the host society. This was also particularly significant because the gap between past and present conditions, as mediated most obviously by language ability, connected to a more tangible, innate sense of self and self-worth. And I include this last quotation to indicate that in addition to a concern with the instrumental consequences of language learning, the teacher attempted to impart truly practical and perhaps immediately applicable advice. For instance, how to avoid poisonous snakes. This type of advice appeared especially incongruous or even frivolous when juxtaposed with the very real and consequential concerns of the students themselves. And finally, the third assertion indicates a discrepancy between the ways in which the students and the teacher conceive of their respective roles within the classroom context. On the one hand, the teacher saw her role as more of that of a guide or mentor than that of a traditional teacher. This was evident in her use of language throughout the course. For instance, she would say, "I encourage you to," or "I suggest," rather than "you need to," or "I want you to." She also made frequent attempts to recognize, acknowledge, and even celebrate the rich experiences and backgrounds of the students themselves. Students, on the other hand, held more traditional notions of the student-teacher relationship and perceived authority as residing with the teacher. Thus, their questions, responses, and comments were invariably preceded by the honorific teacher rather than by her name. During interviews, however, the students occasionally referred to their teacher by name. Even so, it was also evident that the students' feelings of respect intermingled with recognition of and genuine appreciation for their teacher's dedication. So I include this diagram to indicate that this differential in authority and power between the teacher and the students, a gap that was constructed and reinforced precisely by their relative roles in the class vis-a-vis their respective mastery of English, that this was also embodied in the spatial arrangement of the classroom. So, for instance, the students themselves were entering the classroom context as peers and equals. They came in with a shared interest and goal of learning English. They sat at identical desks in identical chairs, and their relative positions in the room were such that no one individual student took precedence over another. the teacher remained separate and apart from the students by virtue of her position at the front of the room, which automatically defined her as the authority figure. Moreover, she generally stood throughout the class period, and so she was positioned at a higher elevation than her seated students, which physically reinforced their relative roles in the classroom hierarchy. Taken together, the explicit and implicit curricular aims and implementation led to the construction of an educational context in which students negotiate unfamiliar social and cultural norms and behaviors alongside formal language learning. Mastery of grammatical correct English was closely tied not only to instrumental aims and opportunities, but also had very real implications for more intangible notions having to do with identity, legibility, and legitimacy. There was some tension between competing perspectives of the student-teacher relationship, but ultimately, respect for the authority localized in the role of the teacher existed alongside a true appreciation of and even affection for the person of the teacher. The relatively high levels of educational and career attainment by the students in this particular class has to be noted. And for these students, the connection of language to identity and legitimacy was particularly heightened. And accordingly, there was an associated tension between feelings of optimism about being in the resettlement context and frustration, particularly relating to their perceived resources and opportunities. Accordingly, there appeared to be a gap between the needs as they were expressed by the students and how those needs were interpreted and supported by local organizations and community stakeholders. And moreover, the ways in which these local organizations ascribed needs and services to refugees reflected and reinforced a particular difference in acknowledgement of authority and legitimacy. Given the ways in which notions of refugee status, identity, and experiences are commonly portrayed, it is important to acknowledge that refugee status is deeply embedded in broader political discourses. Therefore, this study sought to contextualize language acquisition and socialization more broadly by focusing mainly on the emic perspectives of the adult refugee students themselves. The hope is that by shifting this research frame toward the experiences of refugees, the study may give voice to individuals who are too often marginalized in narratives and discourses of refugeedom. So these are some threads that have emerged from this study, including recognition of students' broader notions of personhood, identity, and the good life, via their immediate educational projects, as well as the shifting terrain of gender as individuals negotiate, construct, and reconstruct notions of gender within the liminal spaces of displacement and resettlement. And I think these emergent threads are significant because they challenge a dominant Western discourse that typically situates refugeedom within a narrative of victimhood. And it does this by touching upon, or attempts to do this, by touching upon notions of status, sense of self, and ideals of human potential and striving, and by focusing on the flourishing aspirations and complexity of individuals who happen to be refugees. Thank you. Those are my references.
Thank you very much.